Welcome to the final installment of the Easy-ish Wood Grain Trilogy, shading. The easiest way to shade your wood is just by blending the lines that are already there. Try to move in the general direction of the wood grain to simulate that directional blur you get with real wood grain. Now, I'm using a blending stump, but you can use a finger if you'd like, preferably your own. Of course, if you want a darker value, you could just lay down some shading with your pencil before you blend. Once again, moving your pencil in the direction of the grain. Keep in mind that if you decide to blend, the value will get considerably darker once you actually rub it with the blending stick or finger or whatever. Now, depending on how dark you drew the wood grain, all that shading and blending can actually hide the lines that you worked so hard on. If that's the case, you can just go back and beef them up a bit. Or if you want to avoid that extra step, or you just know in advance you will be shading the board pretty dark, like a mocha or something, you can always just shade first and then add the grain later. If so, remember, once again, to shade in the direction of the board. And this probably means you can't make it all the way across the board in one pass. And that means you'll have to shade in chunks. If so, try to leave the edges of the chunks irregular and jagged, like this. Otherwise, if you shade in tight, clean columns like this, you'll end up with these distracting dark bands where the columns overlap. So you don't want to do that. After you have your smooth-ish shading, you can go back in and draw the wood grain in and then blend it all together to give it that little more natural look. If you're shading a bunch of boards, like wood paneling, you'll want to shade each board separately. Once again, doing all that stuff about shading and blending in the same direction as the wood grain. And then you can go in and add your shadows and highlights. And for the shadows, you want to add a really thin, dark strip of shadow along two adjacent edges, right up next to the line that defines the board. So here I'm adding my little shadow strip along the bottom and left edges, essentially adding a thin letter L to the inside of each board. And I'll repeat this pattern for every board. Note again that I'm shading the inside edges of each board. Next come the highlights, which is essentially the opposite process. Grab the skinniest eraser you have. I like mechanical pencil erasers for this. And then erase a thin strip along the two edges that you didn't use for the shadows. In this case, that means the top and the right inside edges. Now you may have to rub in the same path back and forth a few times, and that can be frustrating because a lot of times you actually end up smearing the graphite and making the area darker when you first start erasing. But don't give up, just keep rubbing back and forth, and eventually the surface of the eraser will slough off and then you'll start removing the graphite. These highlights are pretty fragile, so try not to smudge them, which means if you're right-handed, try to start all of this process up in the top left corner you're drawing and then work to the bottom right. And of course, if you're left-handed, start in the top right corner. Now, if you love precision erasing like this, you might want to pick up a eraser pencil, which is just like a regular pencil, but instead of graphite, it's made of eraser. This one comes with a brush on the other end, but if you find one that doesn't, you can just stick one on yourself. The brush is, of course, essential to keep from smudging your highlights like this near the end of a pencil drawing process. Because I had graphite all over this paper and then these thin little highlights, so it's really easy to smudge into the highlights. So unless you're able to blow the eraser dust off without spitting, then you're going to want some kind of brush to get the dust off. With the eraser pencil, just like with a regular eraser, you might have to go back and forth a few times before you see a difference, but be patient and carve out those thin little strips of highlights. You'll likely end up erasing some stuff you didn't mean to, like your lines or your shading or shadows. So go back in and beef them up. Maybe even add a little extra shading inside the boards right next to the highlights. The goal is to create contrast right at the edges between your shadows and your highlights, or even just your regular shading in your highlights. So there you go. I hope that's been helpful, and thank you for watching. Best of luck with your drawing.